Hello and welcome to the 11th broadcast of the Nerdflix podcast. This is the 11th podcast, and we've done everything from the Star Wars prequels to Gremlins to Ready Player One, but something we haven't done since the first episode was do an episode on a superhero. But that's going to change today because today is our second superhero episode. This time diving into the DC universe, we are covering Batman. We will be covering 4 Batman movies today. The original 1989 Batman starring Michael Keaton, and then Keaton's Return and Batman Returns. Then Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. So let's get started. Hey, it's time for Nerdflix! Nerdflix! Welcome to the Nerdflix podcast. So we'll start off by talking about Michael Keaton's first debut as Batman in 1989's Batman. This movie was really good, probably my favorite Batman movie, and I really enjoyed this one. This one, of course, is about Batman. Doesn't really feature his origin story much. It kinda does, but it references back to the murder of his parents, but not to him becoming Batman like other Batman movies do. But this movie features the villain, the Joker, and this movie overall is a really good movie. This movie starts out when we see Batman defending the streets of Gotham, and then we escalate into Batman's somewhat of an origin story, not the full origin story, but going back to the murder of his parents and finding out that was Joker. And he fights Joker throughout the movie. Towards the end, Joker has a big parade, and he releases this gas on the city. Then he has a big fight with Batman, and at the end, of course, Batman wins. This movie was really hard to make, and by that I mean they fought for the rights for Batman to make this movie, and they finally got the rights to it in 1979. And this movie came out in 1989, so that's 10 years apart. So they got the rights in 79, and then after that, they had various complications with who's gonna produce the movie, what production company they're gonna sign on to, who's gonna write it, and all the stuff like that. And eventually the movie ends up getting released in 1989, but it took almost 10 years to complete. Originally, this movie was going to focus a lot more on Batman's origin story. Like I mentioned, it does focus on the murder of his parents, but not his real Batman origin story about becoming Batman. But the original idea for this movie was going to feature a lot of Batman's origin story. And not only was the villain going to be Joker, but it was also going to feature an appearance from Penguin and an appearance from Batman's sidekick, Robin. But those two characters and most of Batman's origin story ended up getting cut out for the final script. When they were casting Batman and other characters for this movie, they wanted to have actors that were popular at the time. And among many people they tried to cast for Batman, some of the notable ones being Harrison Ford and Bill Murray. Yes, you heard me right, Bill Murray. He doesn't seem like a Batman kind of person. And also, one of the major people they were considering for the role of Joker was Robin Williams. And Robin Williams really wanted the role, but he didn't end up getting it. A lot of the fighting style that Batman has in this movie is inspired by the fact that the suit doesn't give you much movement in that suit. The suit is very tight and hard to move around in. In fact, Batman can't even really turn his head very much left and right. That's one thing that people do kind of joke about in this movie. That is one kind of funny thing that goes on that isn't too great for continuity, and it doesn't make Batman look so good, but it's a minor detail. One of the notable things is when he's following Joker up the steps of that cathedral towards the end of the movie, and the shoe falls from the top steps down to where he is, and he tries to look down, and you can see he's really struggling to turn that head down. So the Batman suit was really restricting, and Keaton could hardly move in it. And while he was doing one of the scenes, he turned his head, and the entire back, the back part of the costume had this ripped. It had this huge rip in it. Right as he turned his head, the whole thing just ripped. So he wasn't able to move much. So Batman's fighting style in this movie is inspired by the fact that you can't move very well in that suit. The next movie we'll talk about is Batman Returns, the last Michael Keaton Batman movie we see, about Batman and the Penguin and Catwoman all in this movie. And it's overall a pretty good movie. I mean, sequels aren't always as good as the original, but it still did a pretty good job. This movie has Batman, Penguin, and Catwoman. Penguin is trying to do all sorts of things. He's a villain, of course, but he's trying to run for mayor, and only Batman sees the true evil in him. And everyone else in Gotham has sympathy for him and loves him a lot, and they really want him to be the mayor. And Batman gets framed for murder. Penguin takes over Batman's Batmobile, and that doesn't end well. And overall, like I said, it's a pretty good movie. Like I said multiple times already, this movie ended up featuring Penguin and Catwoman as the main villains. But one of the main villains it could have featured was Two-Face himself. Two-Face ended up being one of the villains in the next movie we'll talk about, Batman Forever. But Two-Face was originally supposed to be in this movie. And not only was he supposed to be in Batman Forever, they were also supposed to feature his origin story in this movie. So it could have been Two-Face as the villain in this movie of Two-Face's origin, and that could have greatly altered the way they made Batman Forever. Like I mentioned a while ago on the Gremlins episode, Gremlins had some really tight security on that set, mostly because they were afraid of their precious Gremlins puppets getting stolen. Well, Batman Returns had some really tight security as well. In fact, the art room where they were painting backdrops, the blinds were not allowed to be opened at any time for anyone to see in, and everyone on set had to wear ID tags to prove that they were supposed to be there. And one of the things that happened was there were some leaked photos of Danny DeVito in the Penguin outfit, and it ended up being released into magazines and into the public. Well, the people behind Batman Returns actually hired a private investigator to go find the snitch who sent out the leaked photos, and, so they can punish whoever it was. So they were really not messing around about the security in this movie. When they finally settled on the villains for this movie, they had some pretty different ideas for the villains. Originally, Penguin and Catwoman would be seeking buried treasure. They would be literal treasure hunters, like pirates in a Batman movie. And I don't know how audiences would have felt about that. I don't think that would have been so great. So I'm glad they changed that, but originally Catwoman and Penguin could have been looking for treasure instead of Penguin running for mayor and the stuff they ended up doing in the movie. But originally they could have been treasure hunters. The next movie we'll talk about is Batman Forever. This movie was pretty good. It's the first Batman movie we see after the Michael Keaton ones that does not have Michael Keaton playing Batman. And I thought this movie was pretty good. I like this movie a lot. It has to be, maybe like my second favorite Batman movie. And I thought Batman Forever was pretty good. Batman Forever introduces the villain Two-Face. Remember I talked about him earlier, possibly being in Batman Returns. Well, now he's in Batman Forever. Also, the Riddler. Also in Batman Forever, we get the origin story, and we finally meet Robin, who could have been in the first Batman movie, but was not. So we're finally getting those villains and those heroes who were cut from previous movies. Now they're being in Batman Forever. In Batman Forever, Batman finally meets Robin, and they team up. We see the Riddler and Two-Face, who are working together throughout the movie, and it's overall a pretty good film. Remember earlier when I was talking about the people who tried out and were requested to play certain characters back in the original Batman movie? Well, one of the people I mentioned, the one person who tried out for the role of Joker, who really wanted it, was Robin Williams. Well, they asked him to play Riddler in this movie. And actually, he turned them down for playing Riddler because they turned him down for playing Joker in Batman. So Robin Williams almost played Joker and then almost played Riddler. One of the later Batmans in the Batman movies we see after the ones we will cover today, one of the most recent Batmans is the Dark Knight's Christian Bale playing Batman. I think he's one of the most recent ones. I don't know if he is the recent one. I don't really keep up with most of the DC stuff. I'm more of a Marvel person, but I do think these earlier Batmans are good. But I do know later along the line, Christian Bale does play Batman, and Christian Bale actually auditioned for the role of Robin in Batman Forever. So a later Batman could have played Robin in a previous Batman movie. The person who did end up playing Robin in this movie, and did end up playing Robin in the next movie we'll talk about, is Chris O'Donnell. And he played Robin throughout the movie, like I said. And there's one scene in the movie which Robin goes for a joyride in the Batmobile. And Chris O'Donnell was feeling jealous of the stunt drivers who get to drive the Batmobile all the time. So he decided that he'd take the Batmobile for a spin himself. So they let him drive the Batmobile around set when usually the stunt drivers would do it. Well, he actually ends up wrecking the Batmobile. It's not that bad. He ends up hitting a curb and denting the front. So it's not the worst wreck in the Batmobile, but Robin did end up wrecking the Batmobile. In this movie, we're introduced to the Riddler. And the Riddler is played by Jim Carrey, who had to learn how to twirl the cane that the Riddler holds. Throughout the movie, the Riddler carries around a cane and he twirls it around. Well, Jim Carrey needed to learn how to twirl a cane like that. And while he was practicing, he broke multiple canes and broke things on set. He actually broke multiple canes trying to twirl it, and sometimes lost control of it, and broke things in his trailer or on set. So it took a couple of canes before he learned to do it, and he ended up breaking some stuff. The next and final movie we'll talk about today is Batman and Robin. This is the fourth out of that wave of Batman movies, and the most disliked one. It's my least favorite out of those four. I don't dislike it. It's the same way I feel about Kingdom of the Crystal Skull I talked about last week. I don't dislike it. I'd still rewatch it. But it's not the best out of the other three. But this movie was starring a new Batman actor, same Robin, and this movie introduces Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy. This movie introduces the new characters, Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze, having the origin story for Poison Ivy, also introducing Bane into this. Bane doesn't have that big of a role. He ends up having a role later on in newer Batman movies, but Bane is in this movie, and so is Mr. Freeze. Now, Mr. Freeze, the real Mr. Freeze, the original Mr. Freeze in the comics, was more of like a darker villain. He was really serious, but in this movie, he was more of a lighter villain, even though he does still have that dark origin story. In this movie, he makes a total of 27 ice-related puns, such as cool party, and things like that, that really just are kind of annoying, because sometimes puns can be annoying, but it shows how, in this movie, he's really more of a light character than the serious Iceman he is in the comics. In this movie, Batman and Robin have multiple arguments about Robin's role in the Batman duo. So that's most of the movie right there. And we're also introduced to their butler, Alfred's niece, who later turns out to be Batgirl, well, turns into Batgirl. Which is, well, some comic fans actually didn't like this because it changed up the fact that in the comics, Batgirl was Commissioner Gordon's daughter and not Alfred's niece. In this, Alfred ends up almost dying from a disease, the same disease Iceman's wife has, so they end up curing Alfred, so Alfred lives, yay! And we're introduced to Iceman and Poison Ivy, and Iceman tries to freeze the city, and then at this point in the movie, that's when, Alfred's niece finally becomes Batgirl, and they all team up to beat Mr. Freeze. This movie was supposed to start off multiple spin-offs and more Batman sequels. Of course, we did get Batman movies in the future, but not continuing this series of these 4 Batman movies that were released back then. Because this movie didn't do so well, like I said. Not many people liked it, and it didn't make very much money, so they ended up canceling all the sequels and spin-offs this movie would have made. I talked last week about Harrison Ford getting an injury while on set of Temple of Doom. Well, George Clooney had an injury too while filming Batman and Robin. But his injury was not related to the filming of Batman and Robin. He actually injured his leg off-set playing basketball. Well, now that his leg is injured, it's not severe, and he didn't end up going to the hospital or anything, but so he was still filming. But in the scene in which they're trying to stop Iceman's rocket that he just launched into the sky, you can see Batman limping, and that is because of the injury George Clooney sustained while playing basketball offset. I mentioned earlier how hard it was to move in that original Batman suit. Well, for this movie, they wanted to solve that problem, so they started using a different material to make the Batman suit. But this means the material is lighter and softer, which means it's easier to damage and rip. So George Clooney and his stunt double went through 50 of these new suits throughout the movie because they kept ripping them or ruining them. They went through 50 whole Batman suits. In this movie, we're introduced to Batgirl, and the original idea for Batgirl's costume was to have, instead of the eyepiece that she wears that's similar to Robin's that only covers her eyes, was to have that full headpiece that Batman has with the two big bat ears sticking up. Well, what they ended up doing was going with what she has in the movie, which is just that eyepiece that Robin also wears. Well, this caused a good bit of problem amongst the toy industry, because the main concern of this movie was how well they were going to sell toys. They designed a lot of this movie and the costumes to sell toys better. To make more items, it's similar to kind of what Star Wars does. And so they had already released and made a bunch of Batgirl action figures that has that Batman headpiece that she was originally supposed to wear. But when they changed it to that caused a huge problem amongst the toy industry. So there's a bunch of action figures out there now that have that costume that Batgirl didn't even end up having in the movie, which is obviously a problem when they put the name of the movie on there. Okay, that is all we have for today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nerdflix, and I will see you next time on Nerdflix. The person who did end up playing not Batman, darn it.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye.